When a club does the double in Scotland, it's usually whoever wins the league along with either the Scottish Cup or the League Cup. Because of this, the distinction of winning a double has largely been reserved for either Celtic or Rangers, and in recent years, Celtic have made a habit of winning trebles. In fact, the last non-Old Firm double was when Aberdeen won both the Scottish Cup and League Cup back in the 1989-90 season. Raith did win the League Cup and the second tier in 94-95, but that feels disingenuous considering it's a lower division title. But 2020-21 would see that all change. Amongst the chaos of the COVID season, with Rangers going unbeaten in the league, Celtic fans unleashing the Metal Sharks, fans not being allowed in grounds, it would be St Johnstone who would end the duopoly over multiple trophy successes at the highest level, winning both the Scottish Cup and the League Cup. So in this video, I'll be going through their campaigns in both competitions, covering one of the biggest underdog stories in Scottish football and maybe for some people in world football. St Johnstone for much of their history were known as being a yo-yo club. They would spend much of their time bouncing between the first and second tiers, would spend a couple of years at the top end in the early 70s with European adventures, followed by relegation in 1975, a stint in the third tier in the 80s, a return to the top flight in the 90s, followed by a return to the second tier in the 2000s. The Saints would finally establish themselves as a top flight side in 2009 following promotion, and they wouldn't be relegated until 2025, meaning that their 15 seasons is their longest stint as a top flight side. Cups meanwhile had not seen much success. There were 2 League Cup final appearances in 1969 and 1998, both ending in defeats, and 7 semi-final appearances in the Scottish Cup. The only proper trophy they had won was the Challenge Cup in the 2007-08 season against Dunfermline. This would change in 2014 as under Tommy Wright, they would beat Aberdeen at Ibrox in the semi-final and then Tayside rivals Dundee United 1-0 in the final to lift their first Scottish Cup, finally bringing a major honour to Perth. The 2020-21 season, however, would see Tommy Wright leave the club in the summer, following a 6th place finish, feeling it was a natural end to his time at the club. He would be replaced by former manager and assistant manager Callum Davidson, in what would be his first job as a permanent manager, having had a spell as caretaker in 2014. This season was also the COVID-affected season, where there would be no fans and the League Cup group stages that would usually be played in July would not be played until October. The league campaign wouldn't get off to the best start, with the Saints only winning 2 of their opening 10, but the League Cup group stage was about to begin, and this would kickstart their season. Their opening fixture would see a 2-1 win away at Kelty Hearts, followed by a 7-0 demolition of Brecon City. In the November games, they would suffer a penalty defeat to Dundee United, but a win against Peterhead would see them through to the knockout rounds top of the group, thanks to Peterhead having previously beaten Dundee United. The second round would see St Johnstone come up against fellow Premiership side Motherwell, where, despite falling behind initially, goals from Callum Hendry and David Wotherspoon would see the Saints through. The quarter-final would see an away trip to Championship side Dunfermline, a 0-0 draw after 90 minutes. Sean Rooney would give St Johnstone the lead in extra time, but Ian Wilson would equalise for the Pars, taking the game to penalties. St Johnstone would hold their nerve, however, and win 4-3 on penalties to reach the semi-finals. Now, it should be added, but by this stage, we were going to have a relative underdog win the cup. Celtic were knocked out in the second round at home against Ross County. Meanwhile, Rangers had lost to St Mirren in Paisley in the quarter-final, meaning it was a huge opportunity for everyone else to get their hands on a trophy. St Johnstone's opponents at Hampden then would be Hibs, with the winner of this game taking on the winners of Livingston vs St Mirren in the final. Thankfully, they were playing Hibs in a major cup game and would comfortably beat the Edinburgh side for goals from Jason Kerr, Sean Rooney and Craig Conway, seeing the Saints win 3-0 and advance to the final. The other semi-final would see Scott Robinson score the only goal of the game for Livingston, who ultimately had an advantage going into this season, seeing as they are used to playing games in front of no fans. Sorry, I had to make that joke. The final at Hampden would see the two sides battle it out, but Sean Rooney would head in the corner in the 32nd minute in what would be the only goal of the game, seeing St Johnstone win the League Cup for the first time in their history. There would not be much rest for St Johnstone, however, as only 4 days later, they would be entering the Scottish Cup third round. In April instead of November. Yeah, there's like 2 months between entering the Cup and the final for Premiership teams, which certainly proves to be a challenge. Although this was because of the lower leagues getting shut down for a bit in January, meaning this round was originally meant to be played at the end of January. Anyway, St Johnstone would once again be facing Tayside opposition in the cup, this time away against Dundee, but Guy Melamed would score the only goal of the game for Saints to see them through to the 4th round. This would take 2 weeks later, although delayed due to the funeral of Prince Philip, and they would be taking on League One side Clyde at home. Melamed would once again get the first goal, with Michael O'Halloran getting a second to seal the game not long after. This round also saw Rangers knocking out Celtic, so once again, there is a huge opportunity for clubs wanting to get a hold of the trophy. The quarter-final, however, is certainly one that lives in folklore, however. St Johnstone would be away at Ibrox, and once again, the game would finish 0-0 after 90 minutes. Extra time would see James Tavernier score in the 117th minute in what many thought would be the winner, but St Johnstone would get a corner at the death that would see unmarked goalkeeper Xander Clark rise above everyone and headed the ball towards the net, with it hitting off of Chris Kane, making sure it went into the back of the net. God damn it, Chris Kane, you denied a goalie goal. In the shootout, Clark would save Tavernier's penalty and then Kemar Roof's penalty to see St Johnstone make it into the semi-final. The semi-final would see an All Saints derby, as St Mirren were looking to get past this stage following their defeat to Livingston in the League Cup semi-final. Chris Kane and Glenn Middleton would make sure, however, it was the Perth Saints going through, as they would give St Johnstone a 2-0 lead, and whilst Conor McCarthy would give St Mirren a goal, it wasn't enough for the Buddies, who once again are defeated at the semi-finals. The final, meanwhile, would see a rematch with Hibs, who have once again made it to Hampden. Once again, this is Hibs in a cup final, so St Johnstone did not have much to worry about, and Sean Rooney would once again give St Johnstone the lead with a header in the 32nd minute. That's the same time and way as it was against Livingston. What a weird coincidence. It would also be the only goal once again, and with that, St Johnstone had won the Scottish Cup, and therefore a domestic double. They were also the first team to do a cup double outside of the Old Firm since Aberdeen in 1990, with odds pre-season for this outcome being 10,000 to 1. Yeah, this was half as likely as Leicester City winning the Premier League. I do wonder if anyone was mad enough to put a bet on that. So, how did St Johnstone fare following this historic achievement? Not well at all. Winning the Scottish Cup saw them qualify for the Europa League third qualifying round, where they would get knocked out by some really tiny team called Galatasaray from Turkey?
Wait a minute! Who are you?
This would be followed by defeat to LASK Linz in the Conference League playoffs, whilst Ali McCann and Jason Kerr would be sold on deadline day for a combined £1.8 million. They would not get replaced. The League Cup, meanwhile, would see St Johnstone enter at the second round, where they would get past Championship side Arbroath on penalties, and then they'd once again defeat Dundee, but their defence of their trophy would end after a 1-0 defeat to Celtic at the semi-final stage. Their Scottish Cup defence, however, went very wrong, as their first game would be in the 4th round, where they would be drawn away to League One Kelty Hearts. Kelty would manage to snatch a winner in extra time through Callum Higginbotham, seeing the Saints crash out of the tournament at the first attempt. Their league campaign would also be a disaster, falling down to the bottom end of the table where they would eventually finish 11th, staying up thanks to comfortably beating Inverness in Perth following a draw in the Highlands. The following seasons have seen St Johnstone not get very far in cups or in the league, and whilst they did make the semi-final of the Scottish Cup this season, it is in the midst of a season that has seen them relegated after spending a vast majority of the season rooted to the bottom of the table. Winning a cup double should see a club build on that success, especially with a club like St Johnstone, to become at least a stable mid-table side. Unfortunately, many poor decisions were made, and now they are heading for the Championship after 15 years in the top flight. Saying that, 5 years after Aberdeen won their cup double, they ended up in the relegation playoffs, so maybe there is a curse. Why can't that happen to Celtic or Rangers? That's all for this video, and I hope you enjoyed, especially if you are a St Johnstone fan. I hope going back to this era has cheered you up a bit, especially with recent events. Although, look on the bright side, you'll be in the best league in the world, and you'll have the opportunity of hearing me make jokes at your expense every week with the podcast that I do. Anyway, what were your memories of this team? How long until we see a repeat of this feat? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, Of course, liking, sharing and subscribing are all appreciated, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye.